Assalamu alaikum and welcome to all of our viewers. Whether you're joining us on Zoom, Facebook Live, YouTube, or watching this at a later time, we just want to say welcome and thank you so much for watching. It is the support of viewers like you that keep organizations like the Southern California Muslim Community Organization and Islamicity motivated and able to do the work that we do. So we're so glad to have you on our team. Speaking of teams, we have two sides of the coin with us today, and as we bring out our stars to speak on both the Democratic and Republican sides' perspective in this debate. But before we go on into what is sure to be a lively debate, we want to bring something that keeps us all united, and that is our deen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Harith Burhan to recite a little Quran before we get started.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. صدق الله العظيم. O mankind, surely we have created you from male and female, and have made you nations and tribes, that you may know one another. Surely the noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the one who is the most God-fearing. Allah is surely all-knowing, all-aware.
Thank you so much, Harith, for those words, and may we all keep them in mind as we venture into this debate. Now, for our two stars who are anxious to get the boxing gloves off, it is my honor tonight to present our debaters, Sohail Khan and Salam Al-Mariyati. And we'll start with Mr. Khan. So Sohail Khan serves as a Director of External Affairs at Microsoft Corporation and as a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement, a Christian religious freedom think tank. Sohail served as a policy advisor and counsel on Capitol Hill and a senior political appointee with the Bush administration, where he served in the White House as an advisor for two cabinet secretaries. He was awarded the U.S. DOT Secretary's Team Award in 2005 and the Gold Medal for Outstanding Achievement in 2007. Sohail was awarded the Young Conservative Coalition's Buckley Award in 2010. He was born in Boulder, Colorado, and grew up in California. His parents immigrated to the U.S. from Southern India, and he holds a BA in political science from the University of California at Berkeley and a JD from the University of Ohio. So thank you so much to Mr. Sohail Khan for joining us, and he will be representing the Republican perspective for this evening. Next up, we have Salam Al-Mariyati, who is nationally recognized for his commitment to improving the public understanding of Islam and policies impacting American Muslims. Salam is the president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. He oversees MPAC's groundbreaking civic engagement, public policy, and advocacy work. He is an expert on Islam in the West, Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, national security, and Middle East politics. He has spoken at the White House, Capitol Hill, and represented the U.S. at international human rights and religious freedom conferences. Salam is an adjunct faculty member at Bayan Claremont, a board member of the Muslim Reform Institute, and an advisor to several political, civic, and academic institutions seeking to understand the role of Islam and Muslims in America and throughout the world. He is deeply involved in interfaith activities, and Salam was a co-chair of the Interfaith Coalition to Heal Los Angeles, which formed in the wake of the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings. And Salam will be representing our Democratic perspective for the evening. So thank you both so much for joining us. We have an excited crowd ready for the show. But as exciting as this is for all of us to view, I want to go over a little bit of the debate rules that we've set for the evening. So each side will be allotted 2 minutes to speak, and we want to be courteous with each other and our time as to not interrupt each other and just to make sure that we're not going off for much longer. Though I will be stopping you if we do go above the 2 minute time. Each speaker will be given an opportunity to respond to any points made in counter to their statements. And just to say, while we strive to make this as similar to the debates as possible, which I'm not really sure to that level of entertainment. We can try for sure. We recognize that the true purpose is to inform of the issues. So as we enter this space, we hope that all of you mind that there's no winner, there's no trophy. Our goal is to educate, not to intimidate. And so if this becomes more like a conversation, we're going to welcome that because our goal is to make sure that our viewers leave well educated on both sides of the coin. So inshallah, let's begin. Our first question is going to be that many Muslim voters and many young voters in general do not find a difference between the two political parties. They feel that both parties serve the same corporate rich elites, same on Israel and same based on foreign policy against Muslims. What would you tell them? And let's start with Mr. Sohail Khan.
Well, thank you. And first, I just want to say thank you to the Southern California Muslim Community Organization and to you, Ms. Iman, for moderating this important and very timely conversation. And of course, I can't continue without saying thank you to my good friend Salam, who was one of the first, I should recognize, one of the first Muslim Americans to be actively engaged in politics going back 35 years. I remember having those conversations going back to the 88 election cycle when I was just starting to get involved in politics. And I was questioning Salam as to why he was a Democrat, how he got involved in the Democratic Party. He convinced me, as I was already thinking to get involved, not necessarily as a Democrat, but I have to recognize that he is indeed a pioneer in many ways, including involving when it comes to Muslim involvement in the American political system. And one other minor correction in my bio, just because I'm a proud Hawkeye, I went to the University of Iowa for law school, so just want to make sure that that was stated for the record. But to answer your question, we are living in a time where Americans are increasingly losing faith in institutions, whether that be institutions of higher learning, churches, masajids, synagogues, institutions when it comes to the political, governmental, and that is unfortunate because in all of these instances, these important institutions are bedrocks of our country. But part of that is no doubt that Americans are increasingly becoming disenchanted with the American political system, particularly the party system, and that is made more acute as we see very harsh partisan rhetoric, not only on the presidential level, but even in our local elections. I was listening to a story last night on the radio about how, as we're leading up to next Tuesday's elections, many families are having a difficult time having some of these very difficult questions, not only about politics, but around race and gender and so many other difficult issues. So that is an unfortunate feature in our current time. But for better or worse, we live in a two-party system. And while there are other parties that are emerging, like the Libertarian and Green parties, for the most part, Americans either vote or identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans. And that's why I think it's important for American Muslims, just as I did with Salam back in 1988, is to get involved, register, and then get involved with one of the parties, either party, depending on your own personal worldview. And we can talk about why I think the Republican and the conservative worldview is more effective when it comes to addressing the concerns of particularly the most vulnerable in our community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Salam, the question is in your court now. Thank you.
Oh, sure. First of all, I also want to thank the organizers, the Southern California Muslim Community Organization and the Islamic City and Dower and Aleem, good friends, but more importantly, leaders in our community and in having these kinds of conversations that we need. And I do remember Sohail in his young days. I guess I was young one day, but yeah, it's been a while since we actually started. And I believe that we need people like Sohail. We need Muslims in the Republican Party. We cannot be a one-party community. because that party will take us for granted, pure and simple. That's what's happening to the African American community. That's what's happening to the Latino community. It's people who understand how to strategically place our people on both sides of the aisle, because we're actually working for the same thing, and that is Islam. And whether you want to do it through a Republican lens or a Democratic lens, at the end of the day, I agree. It doesn't matter. I lean towards the Democratic Party because I believe they work more for diversity and for pluralism, while the Republicans manage diversity and pluralism. So, but having said that, I think we need people like Sohail. I remember the Jewish community endorsing Gore Lieberman, and Lieberman would have been the first Jewish vice president of our country. And they were really hoping that Gore would be president. Yet George Bush became president, and yet there were Jewish Republicans who were in his administration, in his cabinet. And there was Elliot Abrams, who was appointed to the National Security Council. Unfortunately, he was the one who engineered the Iraq War. But that is the example where even if we're 80% in one camp, we have to work to make sure that the 20% on the other side gets our support as well. And I think the main problem is that there's just too much corporate influence in the political process, so that a person like you or I who want to give to a political candidate, and we give them $100 or $200, it means nothing. But at the same time, I think we need to organize beyond the dollars, because as you see now, these parties are competing for even 1% of the vote. And even though we are 1% of the country, we are going to make a difference, especially in states like Michigan, Minnesota, even Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona. So we need to just tell the Muslims to go out and vote, and that will get us the recognition we need and put us in a better position to advocate for our issues that involve justice, freedom, and the most important thing, human dignity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for both of your answers. I want to press a little bit because it seems, that there are going to be issues that, come with the Muslim vote being painted as a monolith. And when it comes to this diversity, there are an array of issues that we find Muslims are concerned with, whether it be, tax law or who sits on their children's school board or safety. But one common thread that we find in most Muslim communities is this growing fear of Islamophobia and the feelings that they have of being faced with the real life threat of such actions. I think with the current administration, there has been, a certain rise in such acts. But many Americans, including Muslim Americans, find that Islamophobia is deeply embedded in both parties. Can you respond a little bit to why this seems to be the case? And we'll start with Sohail.
Well, thanks for the question. And if I can just pick up on one, to agree with Salam on his opening comments, and to differ on one issue. I largely agree with exactly what he said, that again, American Muslims are not a monolith. I just came from Texas, where I was helping a local candidate campaigning down there. And the Muslim community, over 24,000 Muslims in the congressional district outside Houston, Sugar Land and Katy, are really, they're supporting both candidates, each on opposite sides for different reasons. And to me, that just shows the health of the Muslim community, because we're not a monolith. Muslim Americans in Detroit are very different from Muslims living, say in Florida or living in New York or living in Southern California. We have different concerns and issues on the local level, and that's a sign of our democracy, the strength of our democracy. The one thing I did want to disagree with just a little bit with Salam is the corporate influence in politics. Yes, corporations are very much engaged and active in the political arena, but I can tell you in my 26 years or so here in Washington, D.C., that the corporate influence has greatly been reduced because of the grassroots activism of Americans like yourselves, who are organizing, getting involved. And just what you said, Salam, because races are so close, 1% and 2% can make or break an election, not only on the national level, but even on the most local level. It's those community organizers that are increasingly having influence. And whether it's, folks like AOC that are primarying very established, well-funded Democrats, or when we had the Tea Party movement on the Republican side, who were likewise primarying well-established, well-funded Republicans. In both instances, we saw how people with less money, but with more activism and energy, were able to take out incumbents based on growing a community and grassroots organization and enthusiasm. So I do believe very much in this system. And I believe that when people get organized, they can make amazing things happen. When it comes to bigotry, there's no doubt that we've seen a spike in anti-Muslim bigotry, and indeed we've seen spikes in other racism and bigotry against other communities, including the Jewish American community. And that is something that we have to join hands in fighting. And you're right, this is not necessarily exactly a partisan issue, but I will say, as a proud conservative and a proud Republican, that many of the voices who have been fomenting that anti-Muslim bigotry come from my side of the aisle. And that's why it's very important for people like myself to speak out against that bigotry within my party. What I can tell you is that those voices have been, while they have come up and been loud, increasingly those forces have been, there's been a counter force against those voices within the party, within the movement. Indeed, when I was serving on President Bush's staff and I was attacked by some, not within the administration, but outside the administration, for being a conservative, serving the president as a Muslim American, it was prominent conservatives, including conservatives who I didn't know, who came to say, we stand with Suhail, and this is bigotry, plain and simple. And so again, it is a growing concern. We need to join hands in fighting it wherever it might raise its ugly head. And the last point I'll say is that this is nothing new. Unfortunately, various communities in our country's history, whether it was African Americans, Hispanics, the Jewish American community, Irish Americans, Italians, Japanese Americans, have faced likewise similar discrimination, and we need to learn from their experiences. And I'm confident that as Americans, we will overcome this bigotry very soon in our lifetimes.
And then, from the left, I think your question for me is, why is there Islamophobia on the left? Because there are those on the left who don't believe in religion, who do look at Muslims as fundamentalists. And you can go to France in the situation of Macron, who's very liberal, very, very much on the left. And yet he's talking about creating a French government version of Islam. And that is the worst form of anti-Muslim animus. So we have to be aware that anti-Muslim sentiment and rhetoric is on both sides of the aisle. And basically people are caving into this myth of Islam versus the West. And it's our responsibility as Muslims, whether Suhail is fighting in the Republican Party or we're fighting in the Democratic Party for inclusion of Muslims. There have been many times where we have been excluded by Democrats on Capitol Hill because of our position on Palestine, for example. And so we have to be aware that just because the Democrats win, it doesn't mean that our problems are resolved. It's just looking at it from a different way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If there is nothing to comment back on, we'll go on to our next question. And so our next question kind of revolves on immigration policy. So the past 4 years has led many Americans to find themselves more engaged with immigration policy, be it their own interest in wanting to travel, the growth of xenophobic ideology coming directly from the administration, and legislation like the Muslim ban, which has directly banned travel from heavily Muslim majority nations. This involvement in immigration policy has led to a growing awareness of some of the faults in the current immigration system. What are your thoughts on what the future holds in regards to immigration policy and what we need to keep and what we need to remedy when it comes to the next 4 years?
Well, I mean, from our standpoint, it's about equity. It's about having a policy that allows, especially those who were affected by U.S. policy and U.S. war and military action, to be allowed into the United States, to be provided shelter. And this president, as you said, has enabled a lot of the xenophobic and white supremacist rhetoric. And so he's the one who said Islam hates us. And he's the one who imposed the Muslim ban. Even though the countries that he put on that ban, there were no incidents of terrorism from refugees from those countries. I mean, when you go into areas like Iraq and you are responsible for the war there and the refugee, and then it leads to Syria, and you are responsible, you are the superpower, then of course you have to take responsibility in taking care of those refugees. But the policy is going to go back to pre-1960 with this administration of giving privileges to European countries and maybe Australia and other New Zealand and countries like that. And as far as the largest refugee problem in the world today, Syria, this administration doesn't want to deal with it, even though we have been culpable throughout the decades for the situation there.
So I'll state that there's no doubt the United States is a country of immigrants. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's true. Most of us on this forum, of course, have either a personal experience with immigration, or our parents or grandparents immigrated to this country. And by and large, we have had ebbs and flows of immigration at various times, sometimes higher and sometimes less. And there's no doubt I'll join with Salam in condemning so-called Muslim bans or attempts to put a religious test for immigration. That I think is not only wrong and immoral, but something that we need to stand against. We need to have a immigration system that makes sense. And there's no doubt that there are people that unfortunately take advantage of our system. There are others who are abused by the system. And so I am somebody with many within the Republican Party joining with Democrats across the aisle who do advocate for a reform. For example, when it comes to the children of people that have come here illegally, those people, there is wide consensus that the DACA recipients, as they are often referred to, that there should be a solution. And there is a solution for that. Unfortunately, it gets caught up in the larger political fights that embroil Capitol Hill. But I can tell you from personal experience, there is a consensus when it comes to addressing that concern. With the refugee issue, no doubt, I agree 100% with Salam that we should continue to be a place of refuge for those that are escaping famine, escaping war, and we have been historically. I would argue this recent anti-refugee rhetoric is something that is very harmful. On the other hand, I do think that we need to be careful that just by declaring that you are a refugee and trying to come to the country illegally, as some unfortunately do, there needs to be some scrutiny and some management there of our immigration policy. And then finally, and this is where I'll disagree perhaps with the Democratic Party and maybe with Salam, I don't believe in the sanctuary city or sanctuary state policy, because that policy basically says that if an individual has done something illegal and they're not here legally, that they cannot be arrested. So we need to be very clear what that means. And there I have to disagree with my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, because I do feel that if an individual has broken the law and federal authorities want to arrest or even remove that person from being in our country because they have come here illegally, then those law enforcement agencies should not be prevented from engaging in that effort.
Okay, thank you so much. Salam, you can have 30 seconds to respond if you'd like.
Yeah, and by the same token, I think the federal government cannot punish sanctuary cities. They cannot punish Los Angeles, for example, or San Francisco. It's the federal government cannot put a gun to the head of state and local jurisdictions and impose their laws or punish them because we're not agreeing with the policy. And the same thing happened with Obamacare. If there were countries who didn't want to apply Obamacare, states who didn't want to apply Obamacare under Obama, the federal government could not punish those states. And the same thing here. If we want to have asylum in our cities, the federal government cannot punish us for doing so.
Thank you so much for that. So our next question goes into a little bit about the freedoms that we hold as a country. So the United States really touts freedom as a value it holds near and dear to its foundational belief. However, we've seen certain groups directly impacted by the lack of freedom. One of these groups being the LGBTQI community. How does your party approach this community, and what do you say to voters who feel they cannot align with a certain party merely because of the views they hold about this community?
I can go first. So this issue is something that I personally have struggled with quite a bit because obviously, as an active American Muslim, we have this particular Islamic perspective when it comes to these issues, when it comes to morality and family life. But my determination is as follows, and that is, we are living in a multicultural country, a multi-religious country, where the law that governs our country is the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution allows for freedoms, as you so eloquently described. And I think that where the line I would draw is that the state cannot discriminate against somebody based on their sexual orientation. But where I would also quibble and have differences with some of my more progressive friends is I don't believe the state can discriminate against those who hold strongly held religious beliefs when it comes to their viewpoint on issues related to the same-sex sexual orientation. So, for example, I don't think, and I think the Supreme Court was right to allow, to prevent and to prohibit discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation. On the other hand, I do think that there needs to be specific exceptions made for religious institutions. So, for example, if you have an Islamic school in Southern California, and the Constitution or the bylaws of the Islamic school state that a teacher cannot be engaged in same-sex activity or living in a same-sex lifestyle, I think there should be some protections for religious institutions. The same would go for, as we're seeing now with the Sisters of Mercy case, when it comes to providing abortion funding from religious institutions or support for abortion services. I do think there needs to be very narrow carve-outs and protections for religious institutions and individuals of conscience who don't want their taxpayer funding or support to go towards programs or lifestyles that they don't approve of based on religious grounds.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, again, let's go to the example of the Jewish community. You have synagogues that are very orthodox, and you have conservative synagogues, and you have Reform and synagogues that actually have gay and lesbian rabbis. And for those who want to go and into the more liberal synagogues, they go there. We cannot impose that condition on the Orthodox synagogues. I don't think we can in the current statute. So I do feel that there is religious protection for conservative houses of worship. The point being, though, is that the Democratic Party does not look at people's sexual orientation as a differentiation. In other words, the Democratic Party looks at everybody as one, and therefore there must be equal protection under the law, and therefore you must apply the law blindly to all. And the LGBTQI community cannot be discriminated against, they cannot be harmed, and they cannot be slandered. So that is really the issue. Is how every community, the Muslim community, and it's interesting that one of the communities that came to the forefront of defending the Muslim community after 9/11 and after Trump was elected was the LGBTQI community. So we have to, when you're entering the political arena, you have to look at the total landscape, not just religious doctrine. Religious doctrine is for our mosques. And we know that in Islam, marriage is not recognized beyond husband and wife. This is the unanimous view of the scholars. But even as the Pope, interestingly enough, the Pope said over the weekend that we should respect the human dignity of the LGBTQI community and accept their civil unions. So he's saying, yeah, let them have their civil unions in the secular process while the Catholic Church maintains its stand on that issue.
Thank you, Salam. Sohail, you can have 30 seconds to respond if you would like.
No, I agree. This is just as Salam said. I think as equal citizens, our friends from the LGBT community deserve every protection under the U.S. Constitution. They deserve their rights and their dignity as human beings, and that's why we're in agreement here. There needs to be a respect for religious differences and religious viewpoints when it comes to these very sensitive issues. But when it comes to a legal framework of protection and equality in the law, we have to look to the U.S. Constitution for that guidance.
Wonderful. And Salam, you may have 30 seconds now if you would like to.
No, I think we can move on because
We're just agreeing.
Get to the meat of the matter, which is the race for the White House.
Wonderful. Yeah. So our next question revolves on education. So education, we have come to find, is a means of achieving socioeconomic security in our nation. However, we are seeing consistent cuts to education, as well as an unprecedented levels of student debt. How does your party view education and its intersection with financial affordability?
To be honest with you, I don't know what the Democratic Party position is. It's not like I did research of the platform on these, but MPAC standpoint, healthcare, education, housing, these are all human rights. And we believe that this administration has really not been at the forefront, especially in the pandemic, of defending the rights of people. You have, for example, in the last 6 months, billionaires, about 643 billionaires in the United States have made more than $845 billion. Yet people are worrying about how they're going to pay for their kids' tuition. Why do I have to pay $70,000 for my child to go to college? What about community colleges? How can we expand that so that we get more affordable education for people? And the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots starts with education. If I live in a poor neighborhood and I get a poor education and I get a poor job with a lot of crime, well then how are we going to lift these people up, the most vulnerable of our society? While they're making $845 billion, other people are being forced to work in high-risk environments, such as the situation in the pandemic, and we're not giving the necessary support for these essential workers. So I believe government should be establishing equity and really holding the middle class. And I'm afraid that if this is going to continue, the middle class is going to collapse.
Thank you so much.
So on this issue, I worked very closely on this issue for several years and continue to be engaged in the issue, particularly when it comes to online education. And I'll say a few things. First, education is primarily a state and local issue. As many of you know, your education, your local schools are funded through your property taxes primarily. And so first of all, we need to realize that even if you do believe in an active role of government in education, that is primarily run by the state and local governments and not the federal. My experience with federal involvement in the education arena is that it largely puts on mandates, puts on restrictions, puts in all kinds of red tape and regulation with very little results. And so I think power should be devolved to the states and the local communities, and more to parents, quite frankly, to make more decisions when it comes to the education of their children. Now, let me give you a specific example. I do support strongly parental choice, particularly when it comes to going to charter schools. And that's specifically for underprivileged children, minorities, and kids that don't have an opportunity to go to the best schools because of their zip code. And unfortunately, the teachers' unions, both on the state level in places like California, my home state, and nationally, are the ones standing in the way of poor children and parents who want to send their kids to better schools, better public schools, charter schools, because they want to lock their kids in to a failing school. And I think that's shameful. I was just in Detroit 2 months ago talking to African Americans in Detroit, and many of them said to me, look, we're not necessarily Republican, but the one thing we do like about the conservative party, the Republican Party, is the fact that you do give us more choices when it comes to education, that you're willing to let us make a decision when it comes to the education of our children and give us opportunity scholarships, et cetera, so that we can be more involved with our children's education. And so that's something that I think is something that is in need of reform, giving parents more control, more ability to make decisions when it comes to their own children. The other things I will say that I'm proud that our party has been engaged in is permanent funding for the historically Black colleges and universities for the first time in their history. When it comes to federal support, because there is federal support, and I don't want to minimize that there are millions of dollars coming from the federal government towards education. For the first time in history under this administration, historically Black colleges and universities are now receiving permanent funding. They don't have to come to Washington, D.C. hat in hand every year to ask for that support. And I think that's something that both parties worked together on this, but it was under this administration that that important reform was made. So those are some of the examples where I think there is a difference of opinion, but by and large, I do think it's state and local, and we need to give parents more control and more empower them to make decisions when it comes to their own children.
Thank you so much. Salam, you can have 30 seconds to respond if you'd like.
No, we can move on.
Okay, wonderful. So as many of us know, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and the coronavirus has hit the American public much harder than many of us imagined at the beginning of this year. With elected officials showing a lack of transparency when it comes to how to protect ourselves from the virus, as well as a plan to help diminish its effect, both employers and employees are left bearing the financial hardship. We saw the CARES Act pass and provide much needed help to the American public at the beginning of this pandemic. However, now, nearly 4.5 months later, we see no additional help. Can you share with what the plans of your party are in order to alleviate some of the suffering and why we haven't seen a passage thus far for a second CARES Act?
Yeah, so this issue is something that has been dragging out for several months, as you rightly pointed out. Initially, in the beginning of the COVID shutdown, there was bipartisan support for getting money into the hands of people who needed it most. And unfortunately, what has happened here is there is agreement on getting money to those who aren't able to pay for their rent, to make their mortgage, to put food on the table. Both parties agree when it comes to those issues. Where the disagreement is and why there is a logjam between Speaker Pelosi and the administration, who's represented by Steve Mnuchin from the Treasury Department, who have been engaged in those negotiations now for over 2 months, is that the Democrats are pushing for a bailout of failing state governments. So Illinois, New York, states that have very high high budget expenses, particularly because of their pensions, because they have these pensions, these legacy pensions that are very, very expensive and quite frankly, not sustainable. They are seeking to get bailout money for those pensions. And that's where Republicans on Capitol Hill are drawing the line. But now some are even wanting to compromise on that because, as you rightly stated, people are hurting. They need the money. And just to put a little bit of a partisan spin on it, as we're coming up to the elections, it's actually Democratic members of Congress who are in very close swing districts, particularly those that won in 2018 in swing districts, that are going to Speaker Pelosi and saying, hey, we need to tone down the politics. We need to get this money out the door. Let's make a deal. The Republicans are willing to get the money to the least of us who need that money. Let's not get hung up on some of these bigger bailouts for some of the states that have had chronic problems going back decades, and it has nothing to do with the COVID crisis. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get that agreement. It probably won't happen before the election next Tuesday, but because I heard even this weekend the talks broke down. But I'm hopeful cooler heads on both sides of the aisle will prevail, and that money will go to those who need it desperately.
Well, I think the problem really is in the White House, and President Trump, one day he ignores it, one day he's against it, another day he's for it. So we can't even see which way the White House wants to go. It depends on which way the wind is blowing for this president. And then in terms of pensions, you're talking about the most populous state. So of course, they're going to need help in states like New York and Illinois because they have to take care of more people. And it's interesting that we as a country, as a government, we are more than willing to bail out the banks and Wall Street. But when it comes to the average person, there's no help. There's no stimulus package for the average family. And that's what I'm really concerned about is that the middle class is going to collapse until and unless we get the stimulus package out there.
So if I can offer just a clarification and something of a rebuttal. First of all, there is agreement when it comes to helping the middle class. That's not where the problem is. I think the pensions issue, let's be clear, both sides of the aisle support people getting their rightfully earned pensions. The problem is that in some states where there were strong union activity, they were able to secure for state employees pensions that were not based on what people put into those pensions. So in other words, the states were collecting money from workers over the decades, but then spending the money recklessly and promising those employees based on their union negotiations much more than they put in. And so well before there was a COVID crisis, those states were already in the red because basically they were promising more to their state workers than they could deliver just from dollars and cents, simple math. And now, unfortunately, I would, Speaker Pelosi and Leader Chuck Schumer are trying to really take advantage of the COVID crisis and really sacrificing those that are harmed by COVID specifically to try and leverage that support for those most vulnerable to get bailout money for these failing states. And you're right, I agree. The bank bailout was something that people on both sides of the aisle supported and both sides of the aisle opposed. And that's something that, again, on a bipartisan basis, we need reforms that we're not, this whole concept of too big to fail that unfortunately both President Bush and President Obama had their fingerprints all over is something that I very much personally am against. And there are many on both sides of the aisle who are against that. But again, I think what's happening here, and it's not shocking, is that there are politicians who are trying to take advantage of the crisis, as none other than the former mayor of Chicago and former chief of staff of President Obama, Rahm Emanuel, said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." I think they're taking advantage of this crisis to bail out friends in states where they have been chronically overspending for decades.
Well, I mean, we all know how top corporations were benefiting from previous protection bills passed by the Congress. So, socialism, it seems only to be applicable to the rich and the powerful. And when states try to protect labor rights, then it's viewed as unions interfering. I mean, it's amazing in the last debate that we're still debating in this country whether there should be a $15 an hour minimum wage. $15 an hour amounts to about $31,000 a year. You can't live in Los Angeles on $31,000 a year. You can't live in any major city for that matter. So we are pushing people out through gentrification, and we do need more labor rights. We do need to make sure that our essential workers are taken care of through pension, through making sure that they get compensation in an equitable manner.
I agree with that, but I would argue that the very states that are saying that are doing harm to their very employees. When, as I mentioned, I was just in Texas campaigning for a candidate. I met so many ex-Californians in Texas who said, "Yeah, we're from California, but we moved to Texas because of the overspending and the chronic."
Yeah, but in Texas, there's no healthcare. You're on your own. Everything is private. That's how Texas does it, is by saying, okay, everybody on their own. whereas at least still in California, the state is taking some responsibility. I definitely don't want to be like Texas. And if people want to go to Texas, by all
Yeah, but
means,
they're
good
voting.
riddance.
People are voting with their feet, you know. I mean, Texas is taking them, and it's not just Texas. It's other states where you have lower taxes, less regulation, and people, you know.
But it's all there's no services. There's really, you know, you're on your own. And again, the government will come and take care of the rich, but when it comes to the poor and the middle class, they get nothing.
Well, again, I mean, it comes to the rich. You and I think, will agree that I don't support government bailouts for companies. I didn't support the bailout by President Obama of the auto companies. I think that they can be reformed. You know, when a company is failing, they go through a bankruptcy. They don't necessarily disappear. People buy those companies and they reform them, and there's a whole business based on that. And so, you and I agree. I don't support socialism at all, including for corporate America. And I think, again, both parties are guilty of supporting Wall Street and other corporations. So we can agree on that. But I will argue that when it comes to workers, oftentimes in the name of protecting workers and helping workers, sometimes policies become so onerous. And for example, this pension issue, I would argue that if I mean, I don't get too technical here, but a defined contribution pension, which is mostly in red states, where you put in money, that money is protected, it's invested, and then you get money back, is probably a more sensible and financially solvent system than a defined contribution system, what you have in places like Illinois that are now going bankrupt. So who's being protected when there's no money? You work 40 years for the state, and then when you turn around and want to get your benefit, they're like, sorry, we just have an IOU written in there because we spent the money on other things. And even though we might have promised you, a Cadillac plan, when it comes down to actually getting those benefits, you're left holding a bag of nothing.
And we have quite a few questions remaining, so we're gonna move on from this one. But thank you so much for the clear kind of difference in perspective when it comes to this question, and one that is really important, I think, for the American public at this time. So we appreciate that. But we've talked a bit about what the future holds. Whether it's getting a legislation passed, not getting a legislation passed, what that will look like. And it seems like the future is what's on the forefront of everyone's mind with the upcoming election. But if we can, let's go to our history as a nation. We see prior to the George H.W. Bush administration that many Muslims did lean on the conservative side. But following his terms, we saw a shift of many switching to the Democratic Party. Can you explain a little bit about why each of you think this seems to be the case?
I don't know, but we'll ask Sahel, why did they flee your party?
So the story, actually, it goes back to the introduction. When Muslim Americans first started getting involved in politics, and it was, again, people like Salam who were the first to enter, into the party, the Democratic Party in his instance, as a Muslim Americans. Muslims have been involved, African Americans, Arab Americans, some Muslim, some Christian, going back decades, but many were not identifying themselves as Muslim Americans per se. But for the first time in the 80s, when Muslim Americans began to engage as Muslim Americans, as Salam said in his opening statement, the Democratic Party was kind of hands-off. And basically, I remember a Democratic candidate, Michael Dukakis, in '92, he said, basically, if you want to help me, stay away from me. And so that was a real kind of shock to those people who were engaged in the Democratic Party as loyal Democrats, delegates to the conventions, and the moment they identified themselves as Muslims, they were told to stay away. Fast forward to 2000, both candidates, Al Gore and George W. Bush, were actively seeking Muslim American support, just as Salam said, primarily because they saw them as part of the American fabric. And I have to give credit to the Clintons for being very much engaged in outreach to the Muslim American community when they were in the White House. And that
we had the first iftar.
The first iftar was Hillary Clinton. That's exactly right. I give her 100% credit for that. But I will say the first iftar attended by a president was George W. Bush when I was.
No, that was Thomas Jefferson.
Well, that was an individual. That's right. That's
The
right.
true Democrat, the first Democrat.
That's right. That's right. Bush was much more forward-leading. He was the first presidential candidate in 1999 to meet with Muslim American leaders in Austin. Al Gore was a little slow to come around to meeting with Muslim leaders. The first national convention to open with a Muslim prayer was the Republican Convention in 2000 in Philadelphia. Talat al-Uthman, a Palestinian American Muslim from Chicago, offered the prayer. If you know and enjoy the Eid stamp that you and I buy at the post office, that was from Speaker Hastert, the Republican speaker, and Grover Norquist, a Republican activist who went to the U.S. Post Office to say, hey, look, if there's a Christmas stamp and a Hanukkah stamp and a Kwanzaa stamp, there should be an Eid stamp. And the U.S. Post Office agreed, and there was a competition, as we know, for the design, and the rest is history. And even after 9/11, I was proud that George W. Bush was the first sitting U.S. president to ever visit a mosque to stand up against bigotry against Muslim Americans and hate crimes. He went twice during his presidency. And we saw a very positive, I can tell you in the White House, Republicans would always say, Muslims help get us here. Muslims help get us here. Unfortunately, after 9/11, with the Patriot Act that unfortunately was passed on a bipartisan basis, that really targeted the Muslim American community, and began to, and then of course you had very active voices in media, on talk radio, particularly on the conservative side, like Ann Coulter and others who were saying very hateful things about Islam and Muslims. And that began to really push Muslims out of the conservative coalition. And then of course, after the Iraq War, we saw very negative anti-Muslim sentiment. And of course, many Muslims and non-Muslims alike around the country did not agree with the Iraq War and saw that as a mistake. And so by 2004, that Muslim support for Bush fractured. It went actually three ways. Some went to Kerry, some went to Ralph Nader, who's Arab American, who ran as, of course, as a Green Party candidate. And then by 2008, Barack Obama, even though he was a little careful and nervous about being seen with Muslims, I remember two Muslim women were removed from a backdrop in Michigan, and Obama was very reticent to meet with Muslims openly. Muslims were, very honestly speaking, very sick of George W. Bush and the Republican Party, and they went to Barack Obama by over 80 to 90% based on some sentiments. I am convinced that, again, both parties need to engage with the Muslim American community on the most local level. And the community needs to engage with both parties, not asking for anything, but demanding our rights as Americans and our representation. And I'm convinced that there will be active and continue to be active Muslim American engagement with both parties, because again, when it comes to a host of values, Muslim Americans are on both sides of the aisle. Sorry for going over so long.
I know. Just
You
real
can have
quick.
more time.
I know we're running out of time, but real quick, it's very important historically. Remember I mentioned the name of Elliott Abrams.
That's right.
He worked under George W. Bush.
That's right.
He brought in certain Muslims who were pro-war and pro-surveillance and anti-Palestine. That was the beginning of the end of Muslim involvement there. And anybody who opposed that would be opposed by certain people like Frank Gaffney, who was another conservative, but his whole outfit was to really keep Muslims out of any political party. And Frank Gaffney attacked Suhail.
Agree.
And he attacked another friend, Grover Norquist. And so that, I think, was a source of that. By the way, the person, one of the people that Elliott Abrams brought to the White House and gave them, all this access at that time, is now an evangelical convert from Islam, who talks about how she came from a Muslim background, now she's Christian, and she's found love. So, and people are free to be what they want, but for them to prop those kind of people up as the representatives of the Muslim community, it shows that there's a lot of political exploitation there. And we have to be careful that when we have access to the government, we are there representing the community's interests, not playing favors with these political, powerful groups.
Absolutely.
I agree with that.
Wonderful. So we have, time for one final question.
Uh-huh.
And, we have spent a bit of time debating each other and have done a great job of highlighting the perspectives of each party. And we thank you so much for doing that, both Sohail and Salam. However, as a Southern girl, I'm from Kentucky, and my mama raised me on the saying that if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. But we're going to take a little bit of a twist on this for this evening and say, we know what each of you think of your party. We've seen you highlight the good about your perspectives. But what are your insights on some of the weaknesses or the issues that you perceive moving forward? And we can start with whoever would like to.
So, yeah, if I could start on this one. I mean, I see that a second Trump administration is going to continue the divisiveness of our country. Trump is not running for the Republican Party. He's running for himself. It's Trump over party over nation. And that has led to one of the greatest divisions in our country since McCarthyism and since the Civil War, and so that would be a major problem. And to the extent that several Republicans have left the party and have left Trump, even though remaining Republican, like Chuck Hagel, the former Republican senator from Nebraska, Ray LaHood, Colin Powell, Christine Whitman, John Kasich, William Kristol, Carolee Fiorina, and she said that she supports Biden because Biden represents humility. He's not. It's not just about himself. Whereas with Trump, it's about himself. It's about service to people. It's about willing to work with people on the other side of the aisle. So you have Republicans now that are leaving Trump because they see this division and how the presidency has been diminished in terms of its prestige and prominence. We're becoming the laughingstock of the country. So we have that issue if Trump is reelected. With Biden, we have the policy issues that we have to, our work, if Biden wins, begins after his election on socioeconomic justice, on the issues that are facing our country throughout the world, on equity and housing security and economic security. So we cannot just leave it to the Democrats to say, yeah, now that they're elected, they're going to take care of it for us. No, we have to advocate even more. But I do believe that Biden at least gives us that opportunity to work with the government. When George Bush was elected, and even though I'm a Democrat, at least I had a way of working with the government on trying to, find recourse, find some kind of mitigation, some kind of redress. With the Trump administration, if you're not part of that inner circle, you're out. It's become a cult, and he has enabled white supremacy. And I believe that this white militia is going to be emboldened if he is reelected.
I'll pick up where Salam left off and just say that one of the concerns I have, regardless of who wins next Tuesday, is the divisiveness within our country and including within the Muslim American community. I think, it's a positive, first of all, that American Muslims are just like their fellow Americans, but that goes both the good and the bad. And the bad is that we oftentimes are just as divided when it comes to a host of issues, including our politics. And so I just really make a plea to all Americans, including the Muslim American community, that we don't lose sight of what Salam said at the beginning of this forum, and that is we should be serving a higher purpose of justice, of the betterment of the country, the betterment of the world. Political parties are a way to get to those goals. And so we shouldn't get caught up in party or even, loyalty for one candidate versus another. Yes, we should support candidates eyes wide open when they support us on the issues that are important to us. And of course, those issues vary from community to community, from individual to individual. But let's really, I beg and plead to all Americans, including the Muslim American community, that we keep our eye on the prize and that we try to remember that we are all Americans. We are part of one larger Muslim American community, and we should remain united in serving the least of us, serving those that need help, working for justice overseas, working for a more sensible foreign policy. and a host of justices on the domestic side, whether it's healthcare, education, housing, criminal justice reform, etc.
So Hale, since I have you in front of
Sure.
people as
Sure.
witnesses, we're working on something bipartisan called the American Muslim Elected and Appointed Officials Network. I think I had mentioned it to you before.
Yes, sir.
Right now, it's only Democrats. We want Muslim Republicans as part of that network of local and state Muslim elected and appointed officials.
Mhm.
And we want the Muslim Republicans to be a part of that. I hope you can join us, and that way we can be even stronger by being bipartisan.
Sure. No, be happy to.
Thank you. And I have witnesses.
You do.
Absolutely. And I think that, both of you have echoed the sentiment that we are stronger together. Many of us don't look, to our left and our right when it comes to who we can help. When someone is in need, we hope that we just extend our hands. And when it comes to kind of diminishing this divisiveness, that is exactly the kind of mentality that we need moving forward. I want to thank both Sohail and Salam for joining us in tonight's debate and allowing us to have a phenomenal perspective on what is on the ballot this election cycle. So thank you to both of you so much. As I was listening, I was thinking about how, many of us have already, registered to vote, if not voted already. And some of us are left now kind of twiddling our thumbs until November 3rd. We're like, okay, I want to do more, but what is it that I can do? And I know that as someone who works in the policy realm and heavily with Muslims, this has been kind of a hot topic for our community. And what I find to be incredibly exciting about all of this is the fact that A, Muslims are wanting to get involved, which is phenomenal, but B, that there is so much that we can do. We can look to the example of SMCO and Islamicity right now with our brothers Dawar Nakvi and Muhammad Abdul Alim in doing what they're doing, getting their neighbors involved, getting their community members educated and ready and excited. If I can just share for those who don't know, I was so thrilled to learn about both of these organizations, as SMCO is a nonprofit and has been serving its community for the last 11 years. Their mission is to organize activities, mobilize the community in such a manner in order to establish brotherhood and sisterhood and unity between different communities, something we could all, take a lesson from. Similarly, Islamicity is one of the largest and oldest online Islamic destinations, operating since 1995, almost the same age as me, so mashallah. Its mission is to be an information platform to communicate universal Islamic values that cultivate peace and dialogue among civilizations. So, when it comes down to it, folks, it's on us. You need to grab your ammis and your babas and your chachas and your chachus. You need to call who you need to. You need to text, Instagram, tweet, whoever it is. You have until November 3rd to make sure that you use your superpower, and that is your voice. That is this power that we can bring our communities together, even if we're voting for different people. We need to make sure that we show up so that our voices can be heard. Inshallah, that is exactly what we do, and I want to thank everyone sincerely who was involved in making this debate possible. I hope to our viewers it was informative and that you get exactly what you need. For any further voting information that you might need, you can visit us at www.iwillvote.com, or I'll do you one better. If you want to look up the MPAC phone number or email us at hello@mpac.org, you'll be coming straight to my email, and I'm happy to answer any kind of questions, or I'll even, bug Sohail and Salam if need be for any further clarifications, because they are our go-to guys when it comes to these kinds of things. So I want to again thank you everyone for being involved, and inshallah have a safe and healthy weekend. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.